Obenfo Obadele Kambon. I want to say welcome. I Never Knew TV. How's everything? Everything is wonderful. It is a joy and honor to have you here. Along with the viewers, myself, I am here humbly as a student, eager to hear the teachings, right? First thing I want to get into is that I heard you once say, and I'm paraphrasing, at the age of 19, you said at the age of 19, I will only wear clothes made by Black people, right? I have two questions with that. One, how did you come to this decision? And the second one, is it true that the car you drive, the phone you use, and the clothes you wear are all made by Black people? So first question, how did you come to that decision?
So the major, I would say, turning point in my life was when I came on the Sankofa journey. So the Sankofa journey, this was 1998. I want to say, just about to turn 19 at that time. So I was born in 79. So I was like, around that age. I had already gone to college. I was at Morehouse College at the time. And my mother said that she was having a trip to Ghana, and it was called the Sankofa journey. So I went along, and, I'm like, I'm supposed to be the good child. Let me do, what mom wants. I really wasn't like deep into it at that point in time. Like, oh yeah, this is whatever. But it was very transformative. And the Sankofa journey is actually ongoing. So we've done it from 1998 all the way up to 2024. And we have that coming up this year as well, connected to the Abibitumi conference. But when I came here, I saw people who were wearing clothes made by Black people. First, they had Ghana Airways, which was a plane where all of the flight attendants were Black people. The pilots are Black people. Everybody is Black. And, I always say that inspiration is showing people possibilities. And by being here, it really showed me the possibilities. That's one. But then the other side is, ever since we were children, my father would always say that we're trying not to spend any money with white people. So like literally we'll drive past 10 gas stations to go to the one Citgo that's owned by Black people. So it just made sense logically of we should be, wearing clothes made by Black people because, it's economic warfare. So if we look at it, some people, oh, you like culture, oh, it's just cute. No, this is actually economic warfare. If you look at the billions of dollars that Ghanaians alone send to places like the United States, the UKKK, all of these people, like anytime we're trying to be modern and wear their clothes, we're literally giving them a grant. We're giving them aid that they're going to use to, build skyscrapers. They're going to use that to pave their streets. They're going to use that to buy bullets to shoot down Black people and billy clubs to beat us in the head. So the money that we're giving them to look like them is money that they're actually flipping in order to hurt and harm us. So it just made sense that rather than financing our enemies, that we should rather circulate that money within our own community. And this is one of the easiest ways that we can do that. If you look at Ghana, every corner has a seamstress or a tailor. So it just makes sense that why would I give my money to my enemies, my colonial enemies, my neo-colonial enemies, anti-Black, so forth and so on, when I can actually just keep that money inside of my community and the money, the billions and billions of dollars, euros, pounds that would go to my enemies. Imagine if Black people here in Ghana stopped wearing white people clothes, every single road in Ghana would be paved just by that one single thing. That's not even talking about, the alcohol that we get from them or the cigarettes that we get from them or, the cars that we get, any number of other things. That one single decision could pave every single road in Ghana. So it just makes logical sense that, you're not supposed to finance your enemy. You're supposed to, destroy your enemy. And at the very least, you should starve your enemy if you don't have, let's say, the capacity to destroy them outright.
Next question I had is that, what was that transition like for you? Because from what I hear, you grew up in a Black conscious home between your mother and father. There is a transition of wearing African clothing. So how was that when you went back to the States and started wearing African clothing in regards to the response of your peers?
Yeah, by that time, people already knew what I was on. So, by that time, I had started learning Chi. I had made several other changes. And, for me, everybody just knew this is how I'm rolling. So what it did is it actually inspired other people to do the same thing. There were a couple of brothers who I was at Morehouse with. And when I met them, they wanted to be the next Martin Luther King. They wanted to be preachers, pastors, and reverends. I'm like, no, you got to deal with your ancestors. No more worshiping the imaginary cracker on a stick. No more any of that stuff. You're dealing with your ancestors. You're pouring libation, so forth. So they actually started doing similar things. So it just became like a group of the people who had what I would say just basic common sense, who they called us the mudcloth triplets because we're wearing bogolan. So like, everybody just knew, all right, this is what they are. And beyond just, the clothing, we were bringing in speakers, like we brought in Nana Marimba Ani to speak. We brought in Nana Charles Finch at that time. Just so many of the luminaries who you can think of, came, either speaking at Morehouse, Obenfo Ray Winbush, who some of your viewers may know. But just, we had conferences that we organized about police brutality. This is at the time that Amadou Diallo was shot in New York. And we're like, this is supposed to be an all-Black male institution, and they're not dealing with Black people who are getting shot down in the streets. So we actually had a protest where we shut down, the administration building there at Morehouse, around them not addressing the issues that were going on. And then from there, we had a conference called Ma'at, the Next Movement. So, for us, and, that's going to be the theme that I'm going to continue to come back to. It's all about the solutions that we offer. So we went from that, dealing with our grievances of what crackers are doing, to now we have the Abibitumi conference on Black Power here in the land of Black people, where we're, basically working on how do we build power as Black people. And where we are right now at Abibitumi headquarters is all about that. So here we run entirely on solar power. So we're not paying bills to white people for electricity. Here we have a water catchment system. This means that we collect our own rainwater. And, we also have a solar borehole. This means it's a mechanized well. So essentially, as long as the sun is shining from morning to evening, we get water. And then when it rains with the water catchment, we get water. This means rain or shine, we get water. This is basically dealing with, you have people who are giving lectures about how we need to get free, how we need to be independent, and so forth and so on. It's like, how can you give a lecture about being independent and you got a mortgage? How can you give lectures about Black liberation and that you're paying, white people for every single thing that you need, whether it's going to the grocery store? So, here we have a whole thing of bananas that we just brought in from, right outside the house. Our breakfast, we have ackee. So some of your viewers may know ackee and saltfish. That comes from Ghana. Here it's called anche. So I can go outside and I can get some papaya right over here. That's slightly out the frame. We have soursop growing right here. So, this is going beyond just talking. And that's what the Abibitumi conference that's coming up from September 6th to the 8th. And it's dedicated to the memory of my father, Obenfo Obadele Kambon. And this is where we actually come together and people are sharing best practices in Black liberation. So how do you do this? Okay, well, we have a part water system where part of it is groundwater, part of it is rainwater. This is how we do it. So how do we do in terms of solar? How do we do in terms of wind turbines? What are the things that we do? And then how do we deal with manufacturing? So, I just mentioned to you that we're dealing with biogas here. So this is essentially where you get the methane from kitchen scraps and you use that in order to cook your food with, basically the same way that you pay for gas, that's piped into your home in places like the United States. So, essentially this is what the Abibitumi conference is all about, is going through the best practices of what we can do as Black people in terms of actually building Black power in various ways. Because again, it doesn't make sense for people to be talking about, Black liberation or, whatever people are saying. Sovereignty now is, what people are talking about, Moors, everybody's saying, oh yeah, I'm a sovereign citizen. I don't have to do so forth and so on. But then they're entirely dependent on the exact same people who they're saying that they're trying to be free from. And that's in terms of paying mortgage and paying car note and buying groceries. And they're dependent on water. It's interesting in classical Kemet, the way that you say that someone is dependent is you said that person is living on your water. Like literally, like to say that person depends on you for water. It's like, what else can, the person do or say if they're dependent for, even their very water. And there's a quote from the instructions of Imahu Patahotep, which says, "Usejiman chetef nesu chefti," and it translates to, "He who listens to his belly belongs to the enemy." So, that means that he who feeds you controls you, as Nana Thomas Sankarasi, you're wearing his t-shirt, today. But as he said, and it's a very, very poignant point. So the Abibitumi conference is all about that. So even your viewers and listeners and you yourself, I would invite you to come. That's going to be September 6th through the 8th. And it's part and parcel of what I mentioned earlier, the Sankofa Journey, which goes from the 6th to the 14th. So that's sankofajourney.com. Several people have told me, oh, there are fake Sankofa journeys out there where, people are trying to hijack the name. So if you don't see our picture on there, it's not as, even last year, someone said they went on a fake Sankofa journey thinking it was us and being very disappointed. So, that's how I, had that life-changing experience. And that's what we're doing for other people. And then, even beyond that, if you are living in, the United Snakes of a murderer, then it becomes very, very difficult for you to actually implement anything in the way of liberation. And we've tried. We've looked at Tulsa, Oklahoma. All right. We can look at Wilmington, North Carolina. We can look at Colfax, Louisiana. We could look at East St. Louis. We could look at Atlanta. We can look at, Rosewood. Example after example of us trying to get some degree of, liberation, freedom, or sovereignty, or, what have you. But at the end of the day, what ends up happening is the same thing that happens every time, which is our enemies decide that they are going to wipe that place off the face of the planet Earth. So what we can do, and, several of our, ancestors have told us that until this land, the land of Black people that they now refer to as Africa, until this land is a superpower, no Black person anywhere in the world will be respected. So for us, it behooves us to actually work towards how can we become a superpower in every area of human activity. That's in terms of economically, that's in terms of militarily, that's in terms of politically, socially, in terms of health, every single area of human activity. That's what we're working towards. So that's what the Sankofa Journey is all about. Again, sankofajourney.com. That's what the Abibitumi conference is all about. That's conference.abibitumi.com. That's what Repatriate to Ghana is all about. Repatriate2Ghana.com. Because again, it's about solutions. I don't want to talk to your viewers and beat them over the head and say, oh, y'all are doing the wrong thing. Y'all are paying mortgage. Y'all are paying. No. How can I actually help you move to a different place where you can change the trajectory, not just for yourself, but for your children and your children's children? Imagine your child being able to walk around and, even your cameraman is here. You see the children just on bikes riding around. They're not worried about being Tamir Rice, where they're walking around with a little toy and they get shot down. They're not, worried about being Sandra Bland. They're not worried about being Amadou Diallo. They're not worried about being, the list is literally endless. Like, where do I start? Oscar Grant. Like, if I start listing the Black people who have gone through, all types of murder, brutality, Rodney King, you name it, then, the list is well and truly endless. But here, what they'll realize is that they'll go and visit the Air Force, base here, the Ghana Air Force, and they'll realize Black people are flying their own helicopters and jet planes. What they'll realize is here, they're going around and Black people are running the air traffic control. Black people are, running the restaurants. Black people have their own businesses, and that's just normal for them. We're doing our own thing, and there isn't a white person in sight. And it's very liberating for them in terms of, again, the inspiration of showing them possibilities. So that's what I can say in terms of the actual implementation of various solutions so that we can solve the number one problem on the planet Earth.
As a linguist, right? As a distinguished linguist, can you please explain, for this two-part question, how language influences a person's thought pattern?
Very good. So, there's what's referred to as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And that's probably the strongest version of that, idea, is that language is so strong that if you don't have the word for it, if you don't have a concept for it, it becomes very difficult for you to conceive of something as not part of your reality whatsoever. There have been modifications of that, in this, Eleanor Roche, dealt with this idea of prototype theory. These are just random white people who, have spoken to this thing. Now, as a linguist myself, what I'll say is that there are various things that become very difficult, if not impossible, to fully articulate in the English language. And I say this as a speaker of Chi, a speaker and teacher also, I teach Twi at the university level, also of Yoruba, also of Wolof, also of Kiswahili, also of Kikongo. These are languages that I speak to, from highest levels down to conversational. I would say Kiswahili is more on the conversational level. But like, for example, in English, you could say spirit, right? And it's like just a general term for various things. And it's coming from the Latin word espiritu, which is referring to spirit, which is breath. So, anything from respiration to perspiration to inspire to expire, all those things come from that root of spirit, which is dealing with breath, right? That's their, concept etymologically in terms of the idea. But if you come to the Twi language, there are various words, all of which, would usually just translate to spirit in English. So if I say sum sum, this is an aspect of yourself that is ultimately derived from your father, but is related to your character, your willpower, your desire, all those different types of things. That's sum sum. But in English, that would probably translate to spirit, right? Now there's another word, hom hom, which is referring to the breath of life. That's probably the closest thing to the original intent for the Latin term. So hom hom is coming from the root verb home, which is to breathe. And that is like the breath of life that, is actually responsible for your continued existence. And it's your link to the creator. There's a proverb that says, and that is to say, if you have something that you want to say to the supreme being, say it to the wind, right? So that's, the idea. But again, in English, that would just kind of translate also just to spirit. If I want to say osamang, once you pass away, what was your sum sum as a living person, that now becomes what they would probably just say as a ghost or, a spirit, right? Here is a spirit that's, walking around. But again, there's a different term for the sum sum when it is no longer connected to a body. That now becomes the osamang, right? So that's another aspect. But again, in English, that would just, be spirit. So like, I could go through like 50 words and all of them just translate to spirit, because English doesn't have, the depth of terminological clarity to really articulate all of these different aspects as is found in Twi. Now, people would make the point, well, Twi doesn't have, technical vocabulary and IT vocabulary and so forth and so on. But, there's what I refer to as Greco-Roman baby talk. And usually that's all of the scientific vocabulary that's out there. So when you look at, and, I've made this point on other platforms as well. If you look at these high and mighty scientific terms, you come to realize it's really nothing but Greco-Roman baby talk. So if you say, something in the area of, oh, here's lithium, here's a lithium battery. It's like, well, how can you have a word for lithium? Do you realize that the word for lithium just comes from the word lithos, which means nothing but stone? Do you know any language in the world that doesn't have a word for stone? But, they'll use it and they'll obfuscate it through Greek terminology where you're like, oh, here's this, element that there's no word for and so forth and so on. But when you come down to it, it's literally baby talk, and I can go through, elements, the entire periodic table of elements. And I can show you all this scientific vocabulary, binomial nomenclature for animals and so forth is literally nothing but Greco-Roman baby talk. So in all of our languages, we have the means to conceptualize scientific terminology. And what I also tell people is that at the time where people may not know this particular history, but the Romans invaded the British Isles. And at that time, the term vernacular was referring to the English language, because the English language was a language that was barren. It had no ability to conceive of learning. All learning was taking place in Latin. So it's thought that nobody could ever think of anything scientific or, of high knowledge in the English language. Now look at it. People are like, oh, the English language is the greatest thing. You can't say that in Yoruba, but you can say it in English. It's like, no, English had absolutely no means by which to say any of these types of things. And then the same thing with the Norman invasion. This is when the French also invaded the British Isles. They did the same thing. So all of the low talk was the indigenous English terms. And then the high and mighty talk was what was coming from French. So you have the word pig, which is the indigenous English term, but pork is once it's on the plate and is arranged nice for the high society. Now it's pork, which is the, French term. You have cow, which is the indigenous term, but then you have boeuf, right? That's the beef once it's on the plate. Now you're using the French term. So just to the point, people would say, oh, well, Shakespeare was an illustrious master of the English language. Well, Shakespeare didn't have a word for fiber optic cables. You understand? They didn't have a word for a computer mouse. And literally look at what a mouse is. You're taking something analog that you know because there was a mouse infestation, the bubonic plague and all of that, So they just took an analog thing that they knew and said, let's apply it to this new thing that's coming up. And then the other point that I often make is that these inventions that we, think are so-called tied to the English language were oftentimes invented by Black people. So, I gave an example. I was on the KSM show the other day, that fiber optic technology invented by Dr. Thomas Mensah, right? So here's a Ghanaian who invented the terminology, but we're like, oh, our languages can't convey anything along those lines. So I could go on and on about the inventions. I've already spoken about that at length on other platforms, so I won't go deep, but just to that point that, not only do we have, a rich terminology around various things in the world, in, the universe, so forth and so on, but also all the things that oftentimes, and these are Ghanaians I'm talking about, we're like, oh, our brains are too small. We can't think about those, high and mighty scientific terms. It's like, no, once you actually, it really speaks to, one, not only don't we know the English language in terms of the etymology and the etymological origin of the words that we're using, it means we also don't know our own language well enough to know that all of those words that seem like high and mighty science, we have all of those terms in our own language.
How has the English language impacted Africans in the West and on the continent's concept of spirituality?
Very good. So I think about this often, even in terms of how the English language is actually rewiring people's brains. And I can speak to both in the United States, but then also to here on the continent. There's a certain grammatical structure in terms of how you would say something. So, for example, someone would say, madinkunim, which is to say, I've consumed a victory, right? That's to say I was victorious, I conquered. In English, you would say, mawene. In English, you would say, maya hot, right? Maya hot. In like this is what Tringlish. So they're using chi part of the sentence, then they're using English part of the sentence. But grammatically, they're structuring how they're saying something in the English language, because in English you would say, I am hot. So they're using chi for the first part to say, maye, to say, I have become, and then hot is just the English word. Well, in chi, you would have an entirely different grammatical structure. You would say, ahufrodeme, which is to say, steam has taken hold of me. Ahufrodeme. So it's not, I am this thing. You say, this thing that exists has taken hold of me. The same thing you would say, awademe, that cold has taken hold of me. So in English, you would say, I am cold. So a lot of Ghanaians, especially like in Accra, where Tringlish reigns supreme, they would say, oh, Maya cold. And they're just saying, so it's like grammatically, their brains have been rewired to think about things, even when they think they're speaking Chi. So they have an entire conversation in Chi, but their way of conceiving how a grammatically structured sentence should be has been rewired to how English would say it. So again, so now let's come directly to your point in terms of spirituality. The first time known, I should say, that the word God was used was in a text called Codex Argentarius, which is referring to the silver book. So this is referring to, a Gothic translation into Germanic language of, the Bible, right? So basically they were looking at Germanic people's tribal deities, and they were saying what would best, match with the word, that they have for what would be referred to in other languages as Elohim or anything else. So here you're talking about somewhere around 1,500, 1,600 years ago. This is the first time that the word God appears anywhere in print or is known, at least as we can find it to this day, right? Now, when we're talking about Codex Argentius, this is now basically what I refer to as the equal sign will kill our people, because they've taken a Germanic tribal deity and they're now saying that this Germanic tribal deity, unknown before 1,500 or 600 years ago, is the creator of everything that exists. Now, why is that problematic? It's problematic because you have people who are much older who are writing books such as our ancestors in classical Kemet, who had their own concept of a supreme being. And typically, to be a supreme being, to be a creator, or any creator, it means that there has to be a masculine aspect and a feminine aspect, right? For you to create life, every human being who has children at least knows this, or who has ever been a child knows this, because they know they had a father and a mother. So our way of conceiving of this concept of what we now refer to as spirituality was very scientific, in the sense that everyone knows that this is the order as it exists now, and this is the order as it's always been. So you find this in, for example, in Khumnu, and that's what we call Abibitumi headquarters because it has 8 sides. But you found this in the place called Khumnu, which literally translates to the place of the 8. So you had Amin and Aminet, that's masculine and feminine hiddenness. You had Nun and Naunet, that's masculine and feminine wetness. You had Kek and Keket, that's masculine and feminine darkness. You had He and Hehet, that's masculine and feminine infiniteness. Now, what are they talking about? They're saying that in the beginning, everything that existed was hidden, it was wet, it was dark, and it was infinite. They're basically describing the womb, right? They're literally telling you that if you understand procreation, then you understand creation. If you understand creation, then you understand procreation. So they're telling you something that is very, very evident. It's self-evident that you know that here you start off with a womb. And then in the creation story, it talks about a mound of soil that came up into the womb, which of course represents the phallus. So again, they're going from the known to the unknown. They're going from procreation to creation, and vice versa. They're going from creation to procreation. If you understand one, then you can understand the other one. So just to that point, now what happens when they tell you that Amin, Aminet, Nun, Naunet, Kek, Keket, He, He, Het equals this imaginary white boy called God? Here's a white man with a beard who's sitting on a cloud somewhere with a magic wand zapping things into existence by himself. Have you ever seen a man create life by himself? Have you ever seen a man just come out of a forest somewhere with a baby saying, yeah, I just gave birth, I'm so happy? No, that doesn't happen. This means that their story is a lie, right? You know, even in terms of myth and so forth and so on, they basically extracted the woman out of all of the things that they talk about. Of course, we know that the Greeks studied in Kemet, but it tells you something about what goes on. They ingested something, but a lot went on in the stomach acid of the Greeks, to the point that when they vomited up, it's no longer what it was before in terms of, and this wasn't just there. You can find the same thing in Unu, which is what the Greeks call Heliopolis, because you start off with Atum that has masculine and feminine aspects, and then from Atum comes Shu, masculine, Tefnut, feminine. From there, you know, you have Geb and Nut, masculine and feminine once again. You have Asar, Set, masculine and feminine once again. You have Setech and Nebethut, which again, masculine and feminine. So this is what the Greeks came to study. But when they go back, you know, they're going to Kronos, they're going to, you know, Zeus, they're going into their supreme God is always going to be a man, because in their worldview, which deals with diametric opposites, one thing is good and the opposite has to be evil. That's why even in their religions to this day, God is good, and then God is counterposed by a devil that's evil. That idea of a devil is entirely foreign to all concepts of Black, what we would call spirituality. The idea is that if the supreme being is omnipresent, that means that if something called a devil existed, the supreme being exists inside of that thing that you're calling a devil. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. The idea is, again, going from this idea of masculine and feminine. But when the Greeks got hold of it, when the Germans got hold of it, the French got hold of it, they found a way to extract the female out of it. And, you know, even when they say, God, you know, here you have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, where's the woman in that? Now, when they first got it, Aset was there. You had Asar, Aset, and Heru. But they said, how can we find a way to get the woman out of the thing so it's more in alignment with the worldview of one thing is good, the opposite is evil? If you look at Christian sanity, the fall of man, original sin, you know, all of that fundamental alienation is due to Eve, right? The woman, you know, Delilah, all of these things are based on that idea of, you know, what's good is male, what's evil is female, what's good is white, what's bad is Black, what's, you know, good is mind, what's bad is the body. So, you know, you find different variations on this all throughout Eurasian thought and the Eurasian worldview. And once we're speaking their languages, once we are dealing with their conceptualization of reality, which is a falsification of reality and manipulation of imagery, that's where we get conceptually incarcerated, what my father would call conceptual lockdown, right? It's like you've gone into 24/7 lockdown. You can't see the sun. You can't exercise. You're literally just stuck in this concept of when someone says God, he. So, it really stifles our worldview. It stifles our view of reality. And it really puts us in the hands of our enemies in terms of once they can get you to conceive that one thing is good and the opposite is evil, now every single thing else that you think about is through that type of lens where you're trying to see, okay, well, white is good, black is evil. So what does that make me as a black person? All right, I want to have Mary had a little lamb whose sheep was white as snow, or I want to have a white Jesus, or I want to have, white. Now, that's not a universal concept because when you go to the Songhai language, anytime they want to use an adjective for something good, they use the term bibi, which translates to black. Excuse me. And that term bibi, you find it still in the Akan language to this day, and it means the exact same thing. When you say obibini, abibimine, abibidru, you say bidie, that all of that comes from that same root of black. But in the Akan language, no longer is used as an adjective to mean everything good. Now, because we're on the coast and we've been exposed to the Eurasian worldview, we'll see something black as something bad, just like, white people do. We'll say okra brifo, someone who has a black kra, and the kra is an aspect of the self that also would translate to spirit, perhaps, that comes from the supreme being. But to say you have a black kra is supposed to be a bad thing. Meanwhile, in the Songhai language, it has the exact same word, bibi. When they want to say that something is powerful, they use the adjective bibi to describe it. They'll say wane bibi. If they want to say that the water is pure, they'll say hari bibi, which is to say black water. They'll say, I know hari bibi, give me black water. If they want to, talk about anything like the soil is fertile, even if the color isn't black, they'll say, this is sadiza bibi. That's to say this is black soil. That's the way that they say that is good, it's fertile. And you can find it, just across the board. You find a similar concept in classical Kemet, where even the name itself translates to land of black people. And the idea of chem itself, that's also the root of the word chemistry, is that which is complete, that which is perfect. And everyone aspired to become Asar in the afterlife, where and he was known as the Black One, the Great Black One, you understand? Or Kemet, which was the byname of Aset. And she also had the idea of completion, perfection. The idea is that once you pass on, if you're able to say the 42 declarations, then you yourself would also be called Asar, and then you yourself would be regarded as the Great Black One. You understand? So again, that's not a universal thing. Lots of people think it is, and they only think it is because all they speak is English, and therefore that's the conceptual lockdown that we're talking about.
And also, can you touch on the concept of evil spirits in African spirituality?
Okay. Let me take some water. Okay, so we have to cut out the coughing. So the concept of evil is, again, coming from a Eurasian worldview, because the way that we see things is that these things that in Eurasian worldview are regarded as evil. And this is oftentimes because when they would come to our spiritual systems, they couldn't conceive of, one, there are no churches, right? Okay, if you have a word for the supreme being, and of course we did, they were like, well, then where are your churches? For us, it was like, this is insane. How can the one that created everything that exists have a house that's a church? And it's a guy, by the way. He needs money from you, and he lives in that house over there. It's like, this is the stupidest thing that could ever be said. But then how can you have something that's all powerful, but then there's an opponent who's also somewhere close to being similarly powerful? It's like, how can you be all powerful, but there's something else that you don't control and is doing things to lead people astray? So what they did is that they would find some abosom, or they would find some orisha, or they would find some spirit. Again, the word for orisha would also translate to spirit. The word for abosom would also be spirit. The word for abwetia would also be spirit. Like, they don't have the conceptual depth in order to really deal with this thing. But they would say, okay, well, we'll find an orisha who punishes people for transgressing, and that's going to be the devil. And that's what they did. They took Ishu, the orisha associated with the crossroads, where you make decisions that may be good, that may be bad, but ultimately it's your decision. And then you reap the benefits or the detriments from the path that you chose. That's why Ishu is associated with Orita. That's why in Yoruba, they say, Onile Orita, the owner of the house of the crossroads, right? So the concept, these Eurasians, white people, so forth, they couldn't conceive that there's no devil. So they said, okay, we're going to find some entity in your worldview, and we're going to say that one is the devil. I was just looking at a film called Anikulapo, and when they're talking about issue, in the subtitles it says, oh, you have to make a sacrifice to the devil. Now here's something that's supposed to be a traditional story, so forth and so on. But you can see, and this is just to your point, how the English language has colonized their concept of reality, because issue doesn't equal devil or Satan or anything, where if you have Amin, then you're going to have Mut, and then you're going to have Khonsu as a child. If you have Asar, you're going to have to have Aset, then you're going to have Heru as a child. And, you can find this all throughout. So most people are familiar with that trinity of Asar, Aset, and Heru, but every single town had a trinity like that of a father, a mother, and a child, you see? So, these are just, some things that go into this idea of once you've been exposed to the English language, even when you're trying to, do a traditional Yoruba story and so forth and so on, when it comes time for you to translate issue, here you go translating, here's the devil. Well, all right, well, where's hell then in the Yoruba concept, right? Everyone, when they pass on, they go to, you go to Arun. So, where is that? Where does this come in? But again, that's what I would call the colonization of people's concept of reality. And in doing so, they end up colonizing even our concept of the spiritual realm. God is a man. He's a white guy with a beard. He has a magic wand. He's zapping stuff. It's like just so ridiculous. Whereas in our worldview, our creation story, all of those things are readily evident even to a child. Father, mother, child, everyone can see that.
Can you explain to our viewers what Adinkra is and how it represents a person being a living son and exemplifies a government system?
Very good. So when you look at Adinkra, there are several theories, and there's a good book called Cloth as Metaphor that goes into it by esteemed author G.F. Kojo Arthur, who I actually met back in Chicago when he had a book launch there. But he goes through some of even in the oral tradition, they go through the different stories. But some say Adinkra, the origin of the word itself, comes from a traditional ruler named Nana Kofi Adinkra, who it was declared by the Asantehene that no one should have a golden stool. He was egged on that you should also have a golden stool. You're just as much of a ruler as, the Asantehene. They ended up going to war. Jamang, which was that society, was defeated, and in honor, if we can say that, the artisans who did Adinkra symbols were brought into the Asante nation. And then, because these were Nana Kofi Adinkra's artisans, it came to be known as Adinkra anytime people would write in that symbolic form. Another theory comes that, it comes because of Di Nkra, which is to say farewell, and that this is used oftentimes as a funerary cloth. So people would say, because Di Nkra is to say farewell to someone at a funeral, then the symbolism that you have in your cloth is to convey messages to the deceased, to the departed, so that they take it to the ancestral realm, so forth and so on. So you have these different ideas. But when we come to Adinkra, Adinkra in that sense is referring to the symbolic system, the stamp system. Originally, it was used, they would use feathers in order to basically draw them. So if you picture a pin or a quill or something, you're drawing it onto the cloth. And it started off as a bark cloth, and then became a woven cloth, so forth and so on. That, you have that idea. But eventually, Adinkra's child named Apau, he came up with this idea of using a petua. Now, petua are these small calabashes, and using them as a stamp system. So that's just to give a little bit of background. Now to come actually to Adinkra, this is called, basically, Ohene translates to like the king of all the Adinkra symbols. This means that, when you're looking at Adinkra, it is a set of concentric circles, a circle inside of a circle inside of a circle. And when you look at the idea, in various languages, we have this idea of a metaphor of the human being as a living son. So, for example, in classical Kemet, the ruler would be known as Sa-Ra, the son of the sun. And you have this idea that human beings are the children of Ra in general. You have the idea of, in the Inu creation story, Atum and human beings came from the tears of Atum. Atum is the sun at sunset, right? So again, you have this idea of human beings coming from the sun. Now, beyond that, in Akan language, for example, if you want to say that a human being passed on before their time, the idea is that morning time is like sunrise, high noon is like, when you're at your pinnacle in life, and then you have sunset. So if you say in Chi Obinya Nerewu, you're saying that the person got their death at noon or sometime in, when the sun is shining, Erewu, then it's saying that the person didn't get all the way to evening time. They didn't get to the nighttime of their life. And Yoruba language, the way to say childhood is Arodo, which is the morning of the day. Again, it's this idea that the human's lifespan is equivalent to the rising of a sun going all the way up to the high point and then setting. You find this also this idea in the Kikongo language, where the human being is known as Ntangwa Moyo. Ntangwa Moyo. Oh, and also in Yoruba, they have the idea of dying in the sunshine as Osongongo, Okulo Songongo, which is a person died right, as the sun is shining. So you can picture it like at high noon. That means they didn't get to the evening of their life. There's a set of proverbs that are associated with libation. Mamungu area, mamungu anajo, mamungu kura na mamungu. So when we say mamungu area, that's saying don't let me die in the sunshine, meaning don't let me die prematurely before I get to evening. Mamungu anajo, that's to say don't let me die at night. Night is the time of procreation. That's saying don't let me die before I'm able to procreate. Mamungu kura, don't let me die, at all, which is to say don't let my name fall into oblivion. Naso mamungu. And that means that once all of those three things are accomplished, let me die, which is to say, let me go and join the ancestors so that I can also, ascend to that position. So again, Mamu area, that's that same idea of the human being like a living sun. I was coming to Kikongo. So in the Kikongo language, they have this idea of the human being as Ntangwa Moyo. So my teacher of Kikongo is Nkulu Fukiao, who has since passed on. But in his classes, he would go through this idea of Dikenga. So Dikenga is essentially like a circle. And in the circle, you have these 4 different points. And the points of the circle, and that's those are the major points. That's what's called Biangudi. So in Tangu Biangudi, that's the major points. And then you have Bianduelo. Those are the minor points. So it's 8 in total, but you have 4 major, then you have 4 minor. So if you start off at Luvemba, so Luvemba is the sun at sunset. Now you may ask, well, why would you start with the sun at sunset? For a similar reason to why it was done in classical Kemet, because Atum, again, is the sun at sunset, but Atum is a creator divinity. So why would you start off with the sun at sunset? The idea is that the beginning is the end and the end is the beginning. So therefore you start off with, that's the end of one cycle, but that's the beginning of another cycle. That's the snake with its own tail in its mouth. So when you look at this idea, you're starting off, in this case, at Luvemba. And really, you can start at any point because a circle doesn't have a beginning or end. But for our sake, we're going to start with Luvemba. That's the sun at sunset. Then you go to Musoni. So Musoni is the sun at midnight. Then you go to Kala, which is birth. And then that's also the sun at sunrise. And then you get to Tukula, which is the sun at its high point. And then you come back down. Now, in terms of the hourly time system, so that's, across the time of the sun's movements. But then also in terms of the hourly time system, you have that exact same concept. And you have the major hours and then you have the minor hours to that as well. So, this is essentially what we're talking about now. Adinkra, when you see in the center, you see the idea that the center is the sun. And then you have everything else that revolves around the sun. But you find the same thing on the sarcophagus of Imahu Weresh Nefer. Weresh Nefer. I can spell that for anyone who wants to look it up. And you can actually find that sarcophagus at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And the Metropolitan Museum, here again, you have this sarcophagus, and on it you see a depiction of Behdet, which is a sun with wings, and that's the one in the center. But then also you have at the top and going around it, you have depictions of the sun, again, Behdet, the sun with wings. So the idea is that the human being is a sun in the person's own right in the center, but then also from the perspective of the human being, they're seeing the sun, rise, come to a high point and set, and then do the same thing over and over again. So the idea is that we are human beings as a living sun. So different things revolve around us. right? In terms of your dependents, your children, so forth and so on. So in relation to you, and then you also have, a gravitational pull in terms of those people who come around you, so forth and so on, in the same way that the sun does. But then so I'm at the center of my world from my perspective of how I see things. But then the sun itself is at the center, and then everything rotates and gravitates, which is why we have a very heliocentric worldview. So if you look at classical Kemet, all the way to Congo, I can go on and on. This is our idea of, the sun being paramount, because this is ultimately that life-giving force that causes the crops to grow, so forth and so on. You can read the Hymn to the Aten by Akhenaten, where he goes through praising Aten, the solar disk, and all the things that it does. It makes, the animals creep out, in the morning, and, all these various things. So, this is essentially what we're talking about where it comes to Adinkra Hene. So Adinkra Hene is analogous to what you see on the sarcophagus of Weresh Nefer. That's Wereshnefer. Weresh is the word for like to keep watch, right? And then Nefer is beauty or beautiful, something along those lines. But that's the person's name. So the sarcophagus of Weresh Nefer, you can see it. And it's very much like Adinkra Hene. Adinkra Hene is basically like a simplified form of what you see there. But here you see the sun at the center, and then you see these other axes or ellipses along which other things rotate around that which is central. Now, where it comes to governance, the ruler as well is seen as now every single human being is seen like that, but the ruler of a society is seen like that on the, social scale, let's say socio-political scale. Now, there's a good book by Obenfo Obadele, which is entitled African Philosophy of the Pharaonic Period, where he deals with Ma'at, where you have these different levels. So Ma'at operating on a cosmic scale. That's like how the planets are aligned and how things are, in terms of the star alignment, celestial phenomena, and so forth. That's Ma'at on the cosmic scale. But then on a socio-political scale, the ruler is at the center, and it's the ruler's job to make sure that everything operates very similarly, that everything is in order, people are fed, so forth and so on. So that's the responsibility of the ruler at the center, is making sure that all of these planetary bodies are able to move as they're supposed to move. But then you also have on an individual scale. Now, most people, when they think about Ma'at, they only think about the individual scale, because they'll say, the 7 cardinal virtues of Ma'at, or the 42 declarations of Ma'at. That's only on the scale of an individual of, these are the things that I'm saying, this is what I've done. And it's interesting that you have this parallel, that in the tombs, you would write about what you've done, right? So this means that while you're still living and your tomb is constructed, you write about what you've done. So oftentimes you would have these tomb autobiographies where the person would say, I gave bread to the hungry, I gave water to the thirsty, I ferried the boatless, I gave, food I took care of the widow. So all these things, while you're still alive, you say the things that you've done. But then once you pass on, you go to the Hall of Ma'at, then you say the things that you haven't done. In that you would say, I have not, overstepped the widow's boundary. This means that the widow doesn't have anyone to protect her. So it's very easy to take advantage. But you say, I have not done that. I have not, slain a person. I have not cursed the ruler. I have not done this. I have not done that. So you have these types of parallels. But again, to come back to your question, which is Adinkra Hene, this is what you see is that on different, it's sort of like a fractal, if you want to look at it like that. As an individual, any human being, is Adinkra Hene. You're at the center of your perspective. You see the things that revolve around your life. On a social political level, the ruler is like that as well, where all these other people in the society revolve around, and it's the ruler's responsibility to maintain order, to maintain Ma'at. If there's disorder, and you find this in classical Kemet, there are texts like the prophecy of Nefertiti that talks about when these non-Black Eurasians come in, they bring death and destruction, rape and ravage, pillage and plunder. This means that there is no ruler to ensure order, and we see what happens when that happens. But then also on the cosmic scale, here now you have Ra. So Ra is at the center, and all these other planetary bodies are revolving around Ra as well. So again, you have these different levels. So where it comes, and this is to the point of the governance structure, on the socio-political level, the ruler is at the center, and it's the ruler's job to maintain order. In your household, it's your job to maintain order, right? And again, it's complementary because you have, on the socio-political level, the male ruler and the female ruler. right? So you have the Asante Hindi, the Asante Hima. You have, the rule of classical Kemet, which would be the him, which would, they usually translate that as majesty, but really it translates to servant. So the way that you refer to the ruler is you refer to the ruler as him, oftentimes him Necher, the servant of the Necher. This means the highest office is to be a servant. You have that same concept in Akan language where they say, anyone who wants to be a ruler should first learn service. So that's the idea. So, essentially, I could go on and on because, you hit topics that I like to talk about, but I'll pause there so you can come with your next question.
Why are Black men struggling so much with embracing manhood?
Because it serves the enemies of Black people to ensure that that is the case. That's a short, I can make that just my answer. All right, next question. If you want me to elaborate on it, there's a noted psychologist, Nana Amos Wilson, and he often would speak about how, now he would say that every maladaptive character trait that you see in the personality of Black people is there, not because we want it to be there, but because it serves the interests of those who put it there. There's a quote along those lines that says, if you want to understand any problem, in that case, he's talking about in the United States of a murderer. If you want to understand any problem, don't look at who suffers from the problem, look at who benefits from the problem. So if you are concerned that there's going to be Nana Nat Turner who's going to come through and bash your baby's heads on the wall, what is best to do is to take preemptive steps, a preemptive strike, in order to make sure that there are no men to do that. So there will either be boys or they will turn themselves into girls. There will be anything other than someone who's going to smash your baby's head. And this is related to, oftentimes people talk about, and you may have had this, you're a Black man, I'm a Black man, where there's like a white woman in an elevator and she'll clutch her purse like, now what is that? That is that she thinks that she should have her skull bashed in by Black people. Not that you're going to do it, but she knows something about all the atrocities that have been created, not just by the white man, but the white mother who told the white man to do that, right? Because, people like to let the white woman off the hook. Oh, let's go get voting rights for white women. Oh, no. Who raised the white man to do the lynching? And then, when he brought the severed Black penis, who's the one who put it in the attic as a keepsake, as an heirloom, as a hand-me-down? Nothing but, the white woman. So I can come back to that point if you want, but, let's deal with the point at hand. So essentially, the reason why there's a manhood crisis is because oftentimes we don't learn about the history until we have a Black studies course in college, but they know about Nana Paul Bogle, who said cleave to the Black and went through the countryside cutting white people's heads off. They know about Nana Samuel Sharp, and directly because of Nana Samuel Sharp is why they had to, the brutish I'm talking about, had to abolish enslavement. Within 1 week of the suppression of Nana Samuel Sharp's rebellion, they put together a committee about how they can end enslavement. Within just a few years of them, and again, I'm talking about the brutish, which was the superpower at that time. We're talking about now in the early 1800s. People know about Haiti defeating the French, but many people don't know that Haiti also defeated the brutish, and they don't know that they also defeated the Spanish. But within just a couple of years of the brutish being put down, because again, at the time, the brutish and the French were at war. So the brutish were like, all right, let's attack this, former French colony and then bring it in, because that was the pearl of the Antilles. So it's like this strategic military thing that's going on. So the brutish sent in all of these, military conscripts, and they had over 10,000 of them that were killed. At that, at any time, that's a huge loss. But over 10,000 of them were killed. They died due to diseases and so forth and so on. So it was a major upheaval. So imagine in England where they think that they have the military superpower of the world and they're beaten by these, Black people. It caused such an upheaval that's why they had to abolish the quote unquote trade, bringing in more Black people. And why did they do that? Again, it's military. Now, what white people like to say is, they heard violins and they were tugging on their heartstrings and they had pangs of conscience and so forth and so on. But when you read the documents at that time, and those documents are available, they said they fear. The United Snakes of a Murder at that time said that they feared that the same uprising that happened in IT could also happen in the United States. So the only thing they talked about was not about moral, blah, blah, blah. They talked about fear in terms of why they actually made the decisions that they made at the time. So again, just coming back to that point, where you look at IT, where, quote unquote, white people are aware of Nana Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who was very, very much an epitome, a paradigm of manhood. They're, familiar with Nana Denmark Vesey, Nana Gabriel Prosser. They're familiar. Some of them are even familiar with Sarah Kamos in classical Kemet, who drove the Hyksos out. Some of them are familiar with, I can go down the list. Nana Kimathi wa Gachuri. Some of them who people know as Didan Kimathi. People are familiar with all of these examples of manhood. So if you don't want a man who is going to challenge you, who's going to cut your heads off, who's going to take back the land, who is going to do all those things, the best thing for them to do is to make sure there are no men around. They have various ways of doing that. One is by confusing black people, black men in terms of their identity and making them think that they should rather be women, to make them think that they should be boys for their entire life. Another way is through the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. If you read Medical Apartheid by Obenfo Harriet Washington, she talks about the experiments that were done in Philadelphia in the prisons. She talks about, these towns where they would release mosquitoes in order to, either release dengue fever or yellow fever, all of these things over the course of time. So my father, and this is Obenfo Obadele Kambon, and we're dedicating, I mentioned earlier, the Abibitumi conference to my father, Obenfo Obadele Kambon, who passed away at the end of 2023. He wrote an article on racial profiling and the rise of the Black Messiah, racial profiling, the New World Order, and the rise of the Black Messiah. And the point that he made is very similar to a speech that he gave on C-SPAN that some of your viewers may be familiar with. But essentially, the point that he made is that when you see, that document, the COINTELPRO document that is now in circulation, where they said that J. Edgar Hoover said that he's trying to prevent the rise of a Black Messiah, that when they're trying to document people, they're taking people's fingerprints. They have stop and frisk where they're trying to get everybody into a database. They're doing retina scans and biometric is tied to your passport or your ID, all these things. Why are they trying to get all this information on Black people, not just in the United States, but throughout the world? And the point that he makes is for the exact same reason as COINTELPRO. They want to prevent the rise of a Black Messiah. But the point that my father made, which is similar to a point made by Nana Fred Hampton, is that you can kill a revolutionary, but you can't kill a revolution. You can kill a freedom fighter, but you can't kill freedom fighting. And, the point that he's making is that this Black Messiah that they're so afraid of is not necessarily a person per se. The Black Messiah is an idea. And that idea is already out in the universe. Just like, any idea that you can imagine, people sat down, they thought about something, and they came up with a solution to their problem. So if our problem is white people, then our solution is there in the universe and is right there. So my father also articulated what he said, this is a solution to, or the solution rather, to the number one problem on the planet Earth. So if you have a man, or if you have men, or if you have manhood, any of the above, where it's going to be a threat to the existence of white people. And this is one thing that, quote unquote, white people have in common. And to bring it beyond white people, all Eurasians have in common is that they all want to survive. And this is, not a fault of theirs. Every life form has that in common. They want to survive. And I should say every life form except for Black people who have been under the tutelage of white people. We don't want to survive. We want white people to survive. And there's a reason for that. So white people want to survive. And then Black people also want white people to survive at our expense. And it's like the house Negro and the field Negro thing, where you find, Black people who's going to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or going to be the Secretary of the Interior, or going to be Secretary of State, all of these different roles that we play for white people. And the reason I extract it to all life forms is that you have a similar type of thing with, in California, you have this ant called Polyergus. And this is what they call a slave catching ant. What does it do? It's a red ant that goes out and enslaves Black ants. And what it does is it takes the larvae of the Black ants, brings it back to its own colony, and it coats the Black ant larvae with pheromones because, ants aren't operating on eyesight. Because if they did say, hey, you're a red ant, I know, whatever, they're operating on pheromones. This is the miseducation process, the analogy that I'm giving here. And what they do is that those black ants, they serve the interests of red ants, even to the detriment of other black ants, because they don't know to do any better and they've been miseducated to do so. Now, there are videos online where you can actually see this process and what goes on, but actually came across a scientific article that mentioned that sometimes those black ants have rebellions. And those are rebellions because these ants are essentially, the black ants are essentially worker ants. They're not queen ants. They can't give birth, so forth. But they have these rebellions where they start to slaughter wholesale the larvae of the red ants that enslave them. Red ants don't like that. So the red ants would like to stop, black ants from having an identity where they realize I'm different from these red ants. I should be fighting these red ants. These red ants are my enemies because, again, they want to survive just like any other, creature. So Eurasians in general want to survive. And that came up when my father gave that speech because none of the white people were saying that what my father said was wrong. None of them said that it was morally wrong or anything else. They just said you don't have the power to do so. Meanwhile, the black people were like, no, you shouldn't do that. Everybody needs to live. Let's all hold hands. Kumbaya and hold hands. So the only living creature that I know of that of their own, volition to whatever degree we could call it their own volition, they want their enemies to survive are, black people who have been under the tutelage of non-black people, Eurasians in general, whether that's the Chinese, whether that is Arabs, because you got black people who want to be Wu-Tang, right? You got black people who want to be, Arab worshipers. They want to pray to a stone in a desert and pretend like they live in a desert and do ablutions on their fingertips as though they don't live in places where there are abundant, waters. That's the deification of Arab culture played out. But they want to pray to an imaginary, white man on a stick. That's the reason why they gave you the imaginary white man on a stick. It's not to save your soul. It's not so you can go to heaven. It's because it serves the interest, just like those red ants are served by putting pheromones on the black ants to confuse them so that they're now serving the interests of the red ants. So the red ants don't have to do anything all day. They just lay in a pile and, lounge around and eat and gorge themselves on what the black ants regurgitate for them. So again, just to bring things home in terms of solutions, that we have a platform called Abibitumi, and this is where the black ants come together, right? There are no red ants to put their pheromones in. They can't confuse us about manhood or womanhood. They have absolutely no access, in terms of that platform, in terms of content, who's allowed to be on it, so forth and so on. So I'd encourage your viewers to download the Abibitumi app. That's one. I would also encourage them to come to the Abibitumi conference on Black Power. That's two. These are now solutions because I've given you general information. You on the back wall, I see educate, inform, and inspire. Now we're going beyond raising consciousness to raising behavior. If we're just raising consciousness, we'll be on YouTube all the time. If we're raising behavior, we're going to do a Nana Harriet Tubman move and bring you off of the non-black platform and bring you onto a black platform. This is now raising behavior. This is the next step. Throughout the 80s and the 90s, the black bookstore, the conscious hip hop, all of that was raising consciousness. We're now doing a paradigm shift to say, all right, enough of that. Let's raise behavior. Repatriatetogana.com. I mentioned that earlier. That's about raising behavior. We've educated, we've informed, we've inspired. Now raising behavior is you need to get out of the land of Amu, Eurasians, non-black people, and come to the land of black people to make the land of black people a superpower so that you can not only stand up to your enemies, but you can defeat your enemies. That's Repatriate to Ghana. You can come to the Sankofa journey, which again includes the Abibitumi conference on Black Power. So you can come and see. Some people are like, oh, one day when I turn 78, I'm going to come and I'm going to visit the continent one day. No. Or some people say, oh, is it perfect yet? They got binoculars. They're like, oh, is it perfect yet? And by the way, everybody is here on the continent except for avowed and declared Pan-Africanists. I don't know if you're aware. The Lebanese are here, but the Pan-Africanists are like, I'm an African in America. Salute. The Chinese are here, and they're stealing all of our gold so that they can have a gold-backed yuan. I mentioned all the Arabs are here. The French are here, and that's where they're getting the uranium. The British are here. The United Snakes is here with AFRICOM. Everybody on the entire planet is here on the continent, except for the people who said they're African-centered, except for the people who said they're Pan-Africanists. So I don't want you to wait until you are 152 before you say, oh, man, I'm going to go and see the continent. I done seen my roots. No, you're supposed to give your productive years in life to the land of Black people so that we can build this to be a superpower.
How has diseases been used to destabilize African countries?
Yeah, so this is very good. So actually, not too long ago, I gave a talk where I mentioned some of the examples of this. So one recent, well, let's say relatively recent, depending on how people look at it, over the last couple of decades, there's this documentary that came out called Cold Case Hammersjold, and it was dealing initially with the death of the UN Secretary General at that time, Dag Hammarskjöld. But the story that came out in the documentary was that there was a group called SIMAR, which was the South African Institute of Maritime Research. And on film, you actually have this white guy, Dutch boy or whatever, who talks about how they set up medical clinics in the Black community, places like Soweto, so forth and so on, these what they call Bantustans. And what they did is that under the guise of free medical care, they were injecting people with AIDS intentionally. And he says that at that time, and you're talking about, late 80s, early 90s, the idea was that AIDS was a killer, right? So the idea was that rather than having a military solution to getting rid of all Black people, if they could have a medical solution to kill all Black people off, because the men are going to infect the women are going to infect the men, they're all just going to die off, and there's going to be an entirely white country. And they actually have, a town there in what's Umzansi, that's the indigenous term for the place called South Africa, where it's an all-white town. But their vision was in an all-white country, like every single Black person has been exterminated due to, medical, so forth. I mentioned a text called Medical Apartheid. That's the authoritative text in terms of depth and breadth, in terms of going into medical experiments that have been done against Black people. Another case also out of Umzansi, that's again what they call South Africa, is this guy, Wuta Basun. And I first came across his story in a PhD thesis, I think it was, by Chandra Gould. And what it was talking about was, it was a very similar setup to what's in the documentary, where this guy was called Dr. Death, and he used things like, anthrax. He was just experimenting with various things on what they call Project Coast. And Project Coast was because a lot of these anti-apartheid activists, they would arrest them, experiment on them with all types of things from, HIV, AIDS, to, different neurological agents, biological agents, chemical agents, everything you can imagine. And then when they died, they would take a helicopter, put them out way over the ocean, and then dump the bodies. So there are bodies that have never been recovered. And that's the coast in the Project Coast. But that's Dr. Wuta Basun. He was able to get off on criminal, they have this idea of Rainbow Nation, truth and reconciliation. Everybody just hold hands and, kiss, whatever. But he ended up being tried in front of one of his good buddies, who was also a racist, white Dutch boy judge, who just let him off. But then he was brought forth, I believe it was on civil charges, and then he was charged with that. But again, after, so-called freedom, Nelson Mandela and ANC come into power, the files of Project Coast were transferred to the United States. And as a matter of fact, the experimentation and the things that they did in Umzansi, again, so-called South Africa, they said that they got their inspiration of how to do that from the United States. And again, the things that I mentioned earlier in terms of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, all these other things that went on, experimentations of letting out mosquitoes that were known to carry, diseases, radioactive, things in terms of putting incisions on people's back and inserting radioactive isotopes inside of their back to see what would happen with a tumor develop, like all of it, and doing this to prisoners. And oftentimes they would do it for the equivalent of like $5. You're a prisoner. Okay, I'll give you this if you let me put this thing in your back. Okay, whatever. And then oftentimes without consent, in the same text, it goes into the origins of gynecology, where the idea was that Black women have a higher threshold of pain. So they would rip their vaginas open, and then they would stitch them back together without any anesthesia, and then rip them open again, and then sew it back together. The woman is screaming, she's crying. and then they're just laughing, so these are things that you come across. So, on the continent, you can see other things in terms of concentration camps that have substandard conditions where diseases became prone and rampant. And the first concentration camp, people think about concentration camps and they think about Germany and the so-called Jews, so forth and so on. But when you actually go into it, you realize that the Germans under the chancellor, they issued an extermination order against the Herero people and the Nama people. And with that, you had a general called von Trotha. And with the extermination order, he says, I'm no longer accepting, men, women, or children. Any who come to, German territory will be shot. They will be driven to the desert. And what they actually did, and I first came across this when I was in undergrad back at Morehouse's like 98, 99. What they actually did is that they had some who attempted to go into the desert in order to escape, the places like, Botswana, anywhere that they could go to. But others, they said, okay, let's try to send back the elderly. Let's try to send back the cripples, the women and children. And what did the Germans do? They, shot them with machine guns there in the desert. I can just go on and on. But the point I was driving at, you were asking about diseases specifically. What they ended up doing is establishing a concentration camp. Primarily the Nama were put in the concentration camp. The Herero, the policy was just exterminate them all. But then, you did end up having some, but mainly the Nama people were put into these concentration camps. And they were literally worked to death, where they are forced to build a wharf of huge stones, boulders. And, these are generally diminutive people, small people, but they're forced to carry them on their backs and so forth and so on until, they get, broken bones, they get diseases, they get all these things. They have substandard food, substandard conditions. And then what they did is that they cut the heads off of the people, and then they sent them to Germany as for scientific medical testing and research. They had this, craniology where they would measure the dimensions of the nose, of the skull, and so forth to prove that these people are really primates and apes and so forth and so on. So, it goes not only into the front end in terms of giving the diseases, but once they give the diseases, now they want to experiment and so forth and so on. There's, several things that go into Ebola and the spread of Ebola and the, circumstances under which Ebola was spread. Same thing in terms of COVID and so forth and so on. So, there's a long history of, non-Black people, what I would say Eurasians in general, whether that's the British, the French, the Germans, or so forth and so on, trying to solve their problem of how do they steal our land without any resistance. And one of the means by which they have done that is through chemical, biological, neurological, psychological, warfare on every front that you can imagine. And because they have the power to do so, they often do so without any check whatsoever.